Hello to you all. As you may already know, the centrepiece of this God's Big Ideas project is a set of videos focusing on the main themes of the individual New Testament books. But I want also to provide some shorter talks on what are traditionally called the questions of introduction, such as who wrote each book, when was it written, where and to whom, why and how. At least some of the answers to these questions are of more specialist interest than the thematic material, so it seemed best to keep them separate. That said, though, these introductory questions are often very relevant to how we understand each New Testament text. In regard to its key themes, the most important issues are usually the circumstances of its readers and the purpose of the book. They tell us what prompted the author to write it and what he meant it to achieve. The genre of the book, what kind of document it is, may also be important for showing us how it achieves its goals. The other questions, such as the authorship or date of each book, are mostly significant for the interpretation of particular passages rather than of general themes. But they also shed light upon the Christian world of the first century. So when they're put together with the same evidence from the other books, they can help us better to understand the New Testament as a whole. This video is the first of these shorter talks on the Gospel of Mark. So let's now turn to that Gospel and begin by considering its author. Early church tradition ascribed the second Gospel to Mark, who was thought to be the person of that name in the Acts of the Apostles and some of the letters, and who supposedly based his text on the teaching of the Apostle Peter. But the evidence of the book itself may suggest otherwise. Mark's first language would have been Aramaic, but the author of the Gospel appears to be a native Greek speaker, and also to draw on traditions about Jesus that were spoken or written in Greek. There's no sign of his translating from Aramaic. Mark was also a Jew living in Judea, but the Gospel is evidently written for Gentiles and it's critical of Jews and Judaism. Also, the author seems not to know very much about Jewish customs or sects or local geography. Not only is he clearly not an eyewitness to the gospel events, as the real Mark may have been, the relationship of his contents to that of Matthew and Luke suggests that he's also not drawing on notes or memories of Peter. And in fact, his picture of Peter is quite limited and unflattering. So Markan authorship seems very unlikely. But the Gospel must have been ascribed to Mark at quite an early stage. How so, if he was not the author? Well, most likely the Christians of the late first century wanted to give apostolic authority to it, and so they attributed it to someone traditionally connected to the leading apostle. It's true that elsewhere in the New Testament 1 Peter does associate Mark with Peter, but not much is reliably known about him. So it's unlikely that anyone would have stood up and argued that he could not have been the author. But as he probably wasn't, and as no other author has been suggested, it's probably best to admit that we just don't know who wrote the book. What about the date? The traditions about Jesus have developed quite a long way by the time the Gospel is written, which suggests a time some decades after his life. But Matthew and Luke are usually dated to the AD 80s or thereabouts, and since they used Mark, it must have been circulating by then. So sometime between AD 60 and AD 80 seems likely. To be more precise about the date, we have to decide whether the Gospel was written before or after the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, which happened during the Roman-Jewish War of AD 66 to 70. This event is described in chapter 13 of the Gospel, where it's closely associated with the future coming of the Son of Man, that is Jesus. Now, on the one hand, this account doesn't fit closely with what we're told about the fall of Jerusalem by other sources, which could suggest that the event is still in the future, though the imprecise detail could have various other causes. On the other hand, although the author still anticipates the return of Jesus imminently, that expectation has apparently been tempered somewhat, which implies that the war is now in the past and is no longer expected to trigger Jesus coming immediately. For this reason, a date for the Gospel sometime in the 70s seems rather more likely. Then what was the Gospel's location, or more specifically, who were its first intended readers? Traditionally, it was linked to Rome because Mark was thought to have been Peter's interpreter, and Peter supposedly ministered and died in Rome. But if Mark isn't the author, then other settings become equally or even more likely. In particular, the book could have originated in the east of the Roman Empire, the Greek-speaking part, instead of in the west. The Greek of the Gospel doesn't settle the question, as it includes both Latin expressions, which you would expect to find in a book originating in the West, where Latin is spoken, and Hebrew Aramaic type expressions, which you'd expect in a book from the East. But the author does seem also to be familiar with early Eastern and Jewish Christian sources, which may point to that area. The fact that he has to explain Aramaic terms and Jewish practices, and that his readers seem to be Greek-speaking and not Jews, rules out an origin for the book in the land of Israel itself. But a very plausible alternative is the city of Antioch, where lots of languages were spoken, and which could explain the, I would argue, incorrect ascribing of the Gospel to Peter and Mark, who are both associated with that city elsewhere in the New Testament. This may be the best option, but we can't know for sure. In any case, although the Gospel may have been addressed to the particular needs of one community, the author may well have expected it to be circulated and used much more widely. Much more important for understanding the Gospel, though, is what else we can learn from it about its first recipients besides where they might have lived. Namely, that they seem to have had a distorted view of Jesus and of discipleship, and to be uncertain about where they stood in relation to Judaism. It's not clear how far they were threatened by persecution or actually experiencing it. Scholarly opinion differs on that. But their apparently unrealistic expectations of the Christian life certainly didn't equip them to deal with it. These points lead on naturally to the purpose of the Gospel. Why was it written? This is perhaps the most significant question of introduction. Only if we understand what effect the author intended his work to have on his first readers can we grasp what difference it should make to us. And while any text may have numerous purposes, for Mark we can identify at least 3 with some confidence. Firstly then, the Gospel demonstrates and expounds Jesus' identity as Messiah and Son of God. And more specifically, it corrects apparent misconceptions of him as merely a wonder worker, presumably based on the miracle and resurrection stories. It does so with teaching on his suffering and death. Secondly, the Gospel explains the nature of discipleship. And again, more specifically, it corrects overly triumphant views by grounding it in Jesus' own example and affirming the necessity of suffering for him. And thirdly, it defines the Christian community in relation to the Judaism from which they had emerged, identifying points of continuity to be sure, but strongly emphasising points of difference. Now let's turn to the question of the genre, what kind of book this is. Before Mark's Gospel appeared, there had seemingly never been any literary works quite like it. It breaks the literary conventions of the time. Most basically, it does so because it's a narrative account and expansion of the early Christian proclamation, or kerygma to use the technical term, which recounts the mission and message of Jesus and climaxes in his death and resurrection. So it includes both the apostolic preaching of the good news or gospel of Jesus and many of the traditions that had been circulating about him in the intervening years, whether in oral or in written form. And the author presents it as a message from God that announces the arrival of God's saving plan in fulfillment of the Old Testament story. Now, admittedly, we mustn't exaggerate the distinctiveness of Mark's Gospel and the similar works that came after it. The author certainly draws on elements of ancient biography by producing a story of a single recent historical figure that commends him and his message and that summons its readers to follow him. But it can be plausibly argued, I suggest, that these figures are subordinate to the book's character as Christian proclamation. The Greek word euangelion, gospel, appears in the first sentence of the book, and there it may refer to the story that the book tells, the gospel of Jesus Christ, or to the book itself. But because the book creates a new category of literature, the term is eventually applied to that category and to all the books that fall into it: Matthew, Luke, John, and various others that weren't included in the New Testament. We should note in passing, though, that strictly speaking, there are not 4 canonical Gospels, but one Gospel in 4 different forms. Mark and the others can be called Gospels because they narrate the single Gospel of Jesus. We should also touch briefly on the sources of Mark's Gospel, though these are more speculative than those for Matthew and Luke. The author seems to have made extensive use of traditional material, that is, stories of Jesus' work and teaching that had been handed down and were circulating among the churches before he began to write. These will initially have been in spoken form, what we call oral traditions, and some probably still are at the time of writing. But some of them have apparently been combined into larger units which may have been written. It's quite likely, for example, that the longer collections of Jesus' sayings in chapters 4 and 13 were pre-written sources. And the author may well have used some streams of tradition that the other gospel writers drew on separately. But we shouldn't think that the author has just taken everything he had to hand and stuck it all together any old how. No, he's selected the traditions he wanted from a bigger pool, and he's combined and arranged them to serve his purpose. And although he seems to have composed few, if any, of the units himself, he's certainly rewritten his sources in his own vocabulary and style, and in order to bring out his key themes. But he does seem to be respectful of the places and times that he's found in those stories, which may explain why the geography and chronology of the gospel is rather a mess. The final questions of introduction to be considered are the unity and integrity of the gospel. That is it all one book, and do we have all of it? Well, everything up to chapter 16, verse 8 appears to be the work of one author. But it's now generally agreed that what follows 16:8 in some of our Bibles, the so-called shorter and longer endings of Mark, were added later and by other people. The more contested issue is whether the author intended to finish at 16:8 or was unable to complete the work or wrote a longer ending himself that was subsequently lost. Many modern commentators have argued for the first view and have offered various explanations for why the gospel might end in such a way. These sometimes point to the gospel's emphasis on the failure of the disciples, which is reflected in the women's fear about passing on the announcement of Jesus' resurrection. But there may be stronger arguments for the other view. For example, 1. The structure of 16:1-8 may suggest that something was meant to follow it. 2. It's focused on Jesus, not on the disciples and their failures. 3. Mark usually narrates the fulfillment of Jesus' predictions, so we would expect it also to recount the resurrection appearances. 4. Matthew and Luke continue the story beyond this point, which suggests that it didn't typically stop here. 5. The resurrection appearances of Jesus were central to early Christian preaching and were in wide circulation by the AD 70s. 6. As the gospel began with open faith in Jesus, it might be expected to finish in the same way. Some of the reflections in the thematic video on Mark are partly based on the view, which I hold, that the gospel wasn't meant to finish where it does. Well, there ends our discussion of the questions of introduction relating to the Gospel of Mark. The next of these videos to be released will be on Matthew's Gospel. Every blessing to you.